I'm Amie Siegel. I'm an artist, and I make works connected to the construction of value and the movement of objects.
So welcome everybody. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery. It's a real delight to see you all here joining us this Friday evening in front of this incredibly iconic work in the National Gallery's collection. We're joined here by Amie Siegel for tonight's Unexpected talk. Now, as you might know, The Unexpected View is a series where we invite some of the most important of cultural practitioners today, artists, to come into the collection, to choose a work, and to reflect on some of its themes, its ideas, but also draw on these ideas through their own practice. So perhaps by the end of the conversation, we might be able to reflect on the work in a very different way. Now, this isn't the first time that I'm standing in this room with Amie. We were here last summer, or the summer before, shooting for a new film work that Amie has been making that focuses on paintings by George Stubbs, and the moment that many of these works came together for an exhibition at the Milton Keynes Gallery in 2019. So we'll be talking about this film and how we might be able to reflect through the film on the work that sits behind us, a work that really doesn't need any introduction, but it's Whisteljacket by George Stubbs, such an iconic work for the National Gallery and in our collection. Before I continue and introduce Amie more formally, I'd like to thank Hiscox for their continued support as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner, for supporting the talk this evening.
Can we swap?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. I just clocked where the cameras are.
So we are incredibly fortunate to have Amie Siegel with us today, as Amie usually works in Brooklyn, in New York. So we're especially privileged that you've come all this way to join us this evening. Amie works across film, video, photography, sculpture, painting, and installation. She's known for her layered, meticulously constructed works that trace and perform the undercurrents of systems of value, cultural ownership, and image making. We'll explore some of these ideas in our talk today, and through the new film which Amie has made called Bloodlines, which is currently on display at the Scottish National Galleries of Modern Art in Edinburgh. The film is also on view in London, just down the road at Thomas Dane Gallery until the 25th of July. So I really encourage you all to kind of go down there and watch the film for yourselves as well. Amie's recent solo exhibitions include Medium Cool at the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston, Winter at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, and Strata, which was a wonderful show in South London Gallery here in London. She has participated in many significant group exhibitions, including the 34th Sao Paulo Biennial, the Gwangju Biennial, Dakar Art Summit, just to name really only very few of many prestigious shows that Amie's participated in internationally. Her work is also held in in prestigious public collections, including MoMA in New York and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Tate Modern here in London, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, and the Guggenheim Museum. So with that, please do join me in welcoming Amie. So, Amie, I usually begin these conversations by asking about why we choose this work as our kind of conversation started today, but could I ask you about when you first became interested in Stubbs, and where did the kind of conversations first start, or where did the ideas first start become for the film Bloodlines? Maybe a sort of introductory context.
Sure, I'm happy to. Can you hear me all right? Great. Thank you so much, Priyesh, for inviting me to do this talk. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. And it's true, we were last in here filming, which if you go and see, the film is finished, so if you go over to Thomas Dane Gallery, you'll actually see the room that you're in featured, and Whisteljacket featured quite centrally at a certain point, at the end, a kind of denouement of the work. But that work began because in my work in general, I'm very interested in the lives of objects and things that we deem of cultural value, and looking at how value is constructed. And in part, I tend to be engaged by these questions around, the things that we learn are so, sometimes so partial and embedded in systems, and I'm very invested in revealing those systems to some degree, and kind of getting behind the scenes, or even in the case of the National Gallery, kind of back of house, to reveal those systems and the kind of flow of objects and what happens to objects as they move from place to place and context to context. And I happened to be having a conversation with an independent curator who mentioned to me he was doing a Stubbs exhibition, and I just noted it as one does, and then he started to tell me about arranging the loans of the works, meaning loans from museums of the paintings of Stubbs that would go into the exhibition, but also loans from private families, meaning any work that isn't in the hands of a public institution or a museum, that would still be in the hands, privately held, and as it's referred to. And as he told me these anecdotes about the loans, I started to realize that, in fact, most of the Stubbs paintings were still held by the families that originally commissioned them. This work is 1762, I believe?
1762, yeah. So
Although
18th
debatable.
century, yeah. With a question
With a
mark.
question mark within a 3 or 4 year period, right?
Yeah.
But that's a long time
Yeah.
for works to be in one place, and that those places themselves were in fact stately homes all over England and Scotland in the case of that exhibition. And that just immediately spoke volumes to me about paintings by one individual artist that specialized in painting those families. So painting them, their horses, their dogs, the leopards that they brought back from India on their sort of colonial assignments, very complicated images. And what a fascinating way that would be. In my mind, I was formulating this as he was talking, this kind of idea coming together. Oh, I could follow the works as their exhibition picks them up from the houses, and you could see the paintings in situ in all of these stately homes, most of which are private, or only a few were open part of the year, and some of them you would never gain access to. And then you could see them going and entering a kind of public viewing space of the exhibition. And then in the last part of the film, they're returned again. So they sort of go through the same journey, but in the reverse direction on the other side. And in the meantime, you see everything. You see the houses as they are, you see the works, you see their dogs, you see the animals, you see the horses of the present day, you see the incredible stillness and sameness of that world as it's cast in amber. And I'm not going to say anything else too far, or else we'll be in spoiler zones.
Yes, exactly. I think this is really interesting to think about that idea of value and how we come to value certain objects, particularly, here we're standing in the National Gallery where we have some of the world's most iconic paintings, and arguably, we would count Whisteljacket as one of them. What's interesting about Whisteljacket is it's only a sort of fairly new kind of valued, iconic painting in the National Gallery. We only acquired it in 1997. So it's achieved this kind of astonishing status and sort of status within the galleries as well. We position it on this vista, this viewpoint on this enfilade, this grand enfilade of the galleries, where if you look down just in front of us, we see right down to the other wall in the Sainsbury wing, where usually we have a Raphael painting. So you have this incredible conversation and this incredible image of Whisteljacket at the end of this view. And so it's become sort of synonymous in a way with what the National Gallery is. And I wondered if we could sort of reflect on that idea a little bit as well, about why what's interesting about putting Whisteljacket within this context compared to where it was before?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to step back a little bit
Yeah.
to address the entirety of that. But we were speaking earlier about how I think we've come to think that paintings are born in museums or something,
Yeah.
but in fact, they're not. Almost everything came out of private collections,
Yeah.
and then they come to the museum. So I thought tonight we could also step backward a little bit into Whisteljacket history, since the history of Whisteljacket being hung here, even in this building, is so incredibly recent, you know, compared to his lifetime as a painting. And so, stepping back, it's interesting to consider, of course, first of all, that British painting was not exactly sought after in Stubbs' time. There was Joshua Reynolds, of course, and others, but Reynolds painting mostly the British upper class, being commissioned to paint their portraits. And so, it was Italian art that was sought after. And most of Stubbs' patrons, and those that Reynolds painted himself, the aristocracy, would, send their sons on a grand tour, also in part to buy art from Italy and bring it back. And I think that also plays an interesting role in the stories, or the sort of, these are stories, these are anecdotes, they're rumors, I don't think you're getting authoritative art histories when you hear artists speak. You're getting all kinds of speculative information, which I think is good stuff.
Which is great.
Yeah. But, starting with, so I had Joseph and Priyesh kindly kind of put together this little packet.
Some images.
So don't skip ahead yet, because there's a nice order. But in fact, so Whisteljacket, as Priyesh mentioned, came here in, what year was that?
1997.
1997.
Yeah.
Right. But until that time, because he was first commissioned by the Marquess of Rockingham, who you're going to call Lord Rockingham.
Yeah.
Though we were joking before about how many different titles and names come across for one individual. But he commissioned Whisteljacket when he was living at the family seat, which is Wentworth Woodhouse, which is the first image that you see there. That engraving is actually within 10 years of Stubbs being there, okay, and working there as an invited artist to do this giant commission. This is the largest private stately home in England at the time. Supposedly has 365 rooms, one for every day.
So Rockingham was one of the wealthiest men in Britain at that time. He was known for being the prime minister in the 18th century, not just once but twice. So he had that kind of prestige and that kind of, I guess that sort of nobility in a way. Owned an incredible amount of objects that he would have collected from his grand tours to Rome. He commissioned lots of artwork, sculpture, which Amie will touch on in a moment, from this. But also had a huge interest in racehorsing and owned lots of horses as well. So to match all of this wealth, he would commission artists.
So he commissioned Stubbs, who's already known as a great painter of horses at that time, to paint his amazing racehorse, although Whisteljacket wasn't so accomplished as a racehorse, Whisteljacket. But Whisteljacket is accomplished because he's of incredible Arabian bloodstock. He's this kind of amazing, you can see the sort of exaggerated neck musculature there. And it's interesting because he doesn't quite have the typical dished, concave profile of the Arabians. But, he has his full tail. His tail isn't docked, as was the kind of cruel fashion at the time. And there's so much, he's enormous, but he's a single horse occupying a painting, which was completely unusual at that time. And I think it's important to remember that it's many of Rockingham's contemporaries considered the painting unfinished. They thought of it as incomplete. But in fact, they suspected that there was an absent rider to come, right? And that would be, it could have been the king, it could have been Rockingham himself, but the idea that there was in fact going to be somebody there, because what would a horse be for other than as a kind of a seat for a portrait of a very important person? But in fact, you know, what Stubbs was so, I think, clever about was understanding that the aristocracy saw their animals as signs of status and wealth. So to own such a great Arabian, you would want its portrait painted, right, rather than, let's say, your own portrait or your dog or, you know, so forth. He also commissioned well, you can see, if you turn the page, you can see fascinatingly where Whisteljacket was originally, or where he was hung in Wentworth Woodhouse. And this was sort of devised as the Whisteljacket room. And you can see that the molding on the wall echoes the current frame, though this frame was specifically built by the National Gallery, by Peter Schade, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter Schade.
Who's our head of framing here at the National Gallery.
Still.
Yeah.
Very much continuing forward. So the frame is kind of echoing the original molding on the wall as Whisteljacket was set into the wall, right? But he also commissioned 2 other works, which were really curious to me, and they show mares and foals without a background. So they also have, like Whisteljacket, no background. And then they show Whisteljacket and his groom, who is either Simon or Joshua Cobb, seems also debatable, with Whisteljacket and 2 stallions, also on unfigured ground. So again, you get that sense. And the interesting thing is that it is said, again, lots of speculation here, that Rockingham himself requested the unfigured ground. That's some anecdotes. Or that he saw Stubbs, you know, painting Whisteljacket or painting mares and foals before they had a background, and saw the amazing correspondences between the figure on a blank background and his sculpture collection. So, because he was known at that time, he had already gone to Italy and amassed this great sculpture collection, which if you turn the page, you can see 1 or 2 views of the sculpture collection, which was all from Italy, in the hall. So the idea that somehow this was almost a relief in the sense of the figure coming forward without a background.
It sort of reflected that idea of the classical antiquity, you know, the frieze, you know, that we know now from research that all of these statues would possibly have been painted during that kind of classical period. But when it was the height of fashion in the 18th century, it was celebrated for its kind of that pure whiteness of the stone, of the marble. So it's interesting that Rockingham chose that aesthetic, if the speculations are true, that he then requested that actually that Stubbs kept the painting only for the horse, only for that kind of majesty.
Right, and this is sort of where it circles back to my interest in how things move. Because then, after the painting is passed down from generation to generation in Wentworth Woodhouse, the last, I think it's Earl Fitzwilliam, dies, and he has no direct heir, so it goes to his cousin, and she moves Whisteljacket to, is it St. Osprey?
Ossiths.
Yes, it's I always pronounce it wrong, St. Othis Priory. So it goes from Yorkshire, where Wentworth Woodhouse is, all the way to Essex, where, as you can see, it is too large for the room. So what they do is of course, they make a new frame, but most importantly, they lower the floor to fit it in. You can see on the left, there's a step below the door. Literally, it's taken a step down. And the wall molding, you can also see, is quite thick and tall. So they literally had to lower the floor to fit it in, and it's wedged, it's sandwiched from floor to ceiling. And, and later when it is arranged, so this is 1979, and I think in 1997, it is arranged, and Christie's negotiates on behalf of the family for the sale of Whisteljacket to the National Gallery, right? And enter Patrick O'Sullivan, the current head of the art handling team here, who also has an appearance in my piece, Bloodlines, who has to go and figure out how to get Whisteljacket out of there into here, right? Essentially. And in doing so, realizes when the whole team and the conservation team take Whisteljacket out of that white frame, they find white paint all over the canvas inside that they had framed Whisteljacket and painted the frame with the canvas in. So they had a big conservation job. But interestingly, when they did that conservation, they also took a close look, apparently the NG team, at whether in fact there was any evidence that there could have been a place for a rider, like for somebody seated on the horse, and found no evidence whatsoever, just to kind of keep going in some attempt to answer the great question, or the rumor as it continues.
And I think that's what's so unique about Whisteljacket as this kind of very iconic work, because actually it is just the painting of this incredibly, or now iconic horse. You know, as we talked about before, Whisteljacket wasn't necessarily the most successful racehorse. He wasn't necessarily either, you know, he didn't win many races. In fact, by the time that Stubbs came to paint him, I think Rockingham had owned him for about 10 years, and he was siring. You know, he was.
Yeah, he did put him out to breed, basically.
Put him out to stud, yes.
Yes, to stud.
So there's this. It's very interesting that actually, you know, there is no background on this, and we were also reflecting about this, Amie, in the way that actually the unfigured ground here, you know, by removing an object from its context, can allow it to be in several contexts all at the same time.
Exactly, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, people were interested in Stubbs to paint their horses, their things, meaning their dogs, and sometimes themselves, but really as an expression of their kind of wealth and taste and status. Rockingham, he had his portrait painted, but he had it painted by Reynolds several times over. And interestingly, there's another Stubbs down here. If you go, let's see, what is this, 3 pictures down, you'll see the Millbank and Melbourne families. This looks like a great portrait of 2 families, but in fact, there's all the way on your right, there's an Arabian horse, a horse of, you know, Arabian bloodline. There's Pendleton Lamb is on there, who's marrying the woman who's in the phaeton on the left. And the brother and the father are also in the picture. So it is, in a way, a document of the 2 families coming together, very much so, with a tremendous amount of wealth involved and inheritance. But it's also a display of all their things, right, including the horse whose tail is docked, and the objects. And they were also painted as a couple when they got married by Reynolds. No horses, no phaeton. Because you didn't go to Reynolds for that. You went to Stubbs for that, right? And you went to Reynolds for your singular portrait or your couple portrait.
I think I wanted to reflect on this idea of Whisteljacket on this black, you know, unrepresented background. This, you know, the idea that it could be in any context, but also there's something about it, the majesty that brings, you know, almost kind of this idea of fantasy, and perhaps use that idea to kind of reflect on the film a bit more. And so without giving too much away about, you know, what the sort of particular details or the surprises in the film, there are 2 kind of modes of looking. I mean, this is a sort of interesting aspect to your film work, I think, Amie, where you do trace the sort of movement of objects, materials, from one place to another, and how that kind of shifting context might help us understand the value of those objects in a different way. But there's a sort of, the cinematography, I guess, is, you know, you use very, either very still, kind of, almost kind of distant shots, or a kind of slow panning movement of the camera, almost kind of in a way that's sort of not getting too much involved in the kind of details of the, or the kind of, or a narrative or a kind of emotive kind of way of filmmaking, but to allow us to kind of absorb all of the details that we see within the frame, within a room, within a setting. And then, but in Bloodlines, I found it very interesting because you also start using a drone. And there's a drone which follows perhaps a bird in the sky or floats within a house, which I thought was quite spectacular. And there's this sort of interesting contrast I felt between this idea of something that's very kind of process-driven, where you've got these still shots following the action of the art handlers who are kind of handling the paintings so meticulously with lots of care, removing them from the wall, wrapping them, and following that process of working, versus these kind of moments where actually it's quite sort of almost kind of fantastical in the way that we see a context or the extravagance of a home or the awe of nature in some way. Is there something in that you might be able to reflect on and draw out? And is that sort of something conscious within the film, that idea of creating something between tradition and sort of fantasy in some way?
Well, I think the film is, let's be honest, it's 80 minutes, so it has quite a lot to disclose over time, meaning it's not the same thing at every moment, it changes. And I'm also very interested in, I sort of believe that the work teaches you how to view it in the first third, and then it performs that very satisfactorily, to some pleasure in the sort of second third, and then the last part, it just disobeys everything you thought it was. Or at least in some way it starts to be a little bit more, it starts to go against the rules it's already set up. Yeah. And I think some of that is that the last third does become a bit more, that has moments that are more dreamlike, right? As the camera sort of lifts off of its tripod and starts to move through the spaces or through the stately homes. And you arrive at a very particular scene that I won't give away. Sorry, I don't believe in spoilers.
No, we shouldn't give that away. It's quite spectacular. But
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question there. I mean, and it's interesting because I kept thinking about, he's on an unfigured ground, right? But what would happen if you took away just the shadows under the hoofs? I think he would look like he was floating, I think he would suddenly move away. Like there's some kind of great element of fantasy to the painting itself. But I think that in Bloodlines, there's something I really hesitate to use the word painterly, but I think that this can be assigned to the piece only because it does engage with the tableau, with the idea of a tableau, right? That the single shot has a kind of mise-en-scène that is painterly, and in the stillness of it, when you're looking at these kinds of stately homes and interiors that sometimes are missing their occupants, or the only occupant is, a dog, right? Like the family dog. Yeah. So there is a kind of stillness there.
I wanted to reflect on this idea of research and how we might come to kind of find out about certain objects, or the way that they move, and perhaps also think about some of your other works as well. Yeah. And perhaps the way in might be, is the research process often the same? When you find out a sort
You mean from work to work?
From work to work, yes. And perhaps even thinking about, say, we know you as a sort of filmmaker, I came to your work as in film, but you also work in all sorts of other mediums as well, in installation and in objects. There's an amazing work that you have called Dynasty, which is extraordinary in kind of thinking about the value behind a certain piece of marvel.
That one you can give the spoiler.
Yeah. I wonder if you could describe it, but also talk about perhaps the idea of the research behind that, or how that came about.
Well, in doing this whole, for example, just to step back for 1 second to Bloodlines, in doing this whole project about Stubbs, I would say, in connection to research, I don't feel like I have a lot in common with Stubbs, like artist to artist. I mean, I feel some sympathy now, having done this whole project, in the idea. I mean, I love the idea of the unfigured ground, because I'm very interested in what happens to something when you remove it from its context, which is basically a removal of a background, right? But you insert it in a new background. But I think, even though I think he almost accidentally became the like a kind of social documentarian, you know. And I'm very interested in sociological things, but I think the thing we have in common is dissection.
Yes.
So he, you know, kind of famously dissected to a certain extent, and also observed many animal dissections to understand the anatomy of the horse, to paint it well. And I myself don't have the stomach for that. I'm much more interested in sort of dissecting the world as it is, and then going behind the scenes and really taking it apart in this almost, you know, forensic way, let's say. So I think that would be the sort of starting place.
And could we talk about dynasty, because it's just an extraordinary work as well. You know,
yeah, and I think that also has a bit of a forensic quality, both in the research pattern, but in also its display.
Yeah.
Right, because it's very cold.
It's very cold.
Yes. Dynasty is it's a four-element installation, a kind of sculptural installation, and the main element is a tiny, tiny fragment of a funny, like salmon-colored piece of marble, like a little broken-off piece of marble that came from the Trump Tower lobby in New York. And I found it on eBay when I was doing some research on marble, and was fascinated to see that it was being sold. This was right around the 2016 election. I think the election had already happened, but Trump hadn't taken office yet. And so it was being sold as a kind of, I don't know, fragment of somehow being able to be a part of that history. And I just thought it was so bizarre and strange that this little fragment could mean so much to somebody that they would want to buy it, and the price was going up and up on eBay. So I decided I would buy it and make an artwork out of it. And so I put it in a vitrine, and that's the kind of main thing that you encounter. And then the next thing you encounter are two kind of massive book-matched they're framed scans of book-matched marble, of the same kind of marble. Book-matched marble is when they take a piece of marble and they cut it open, and then the patterning, the veining of the marble is mirrored, like a Rorschach. So it becomes a very psychological association as well with that marble. And then I also framed the evidentiary photograph that the eBay sellers sent me, just, you know, to say, in fact, this was in Trump Tower. It was like a little snapshot of where the old floor was meeting the new floor, because by the elevator bank they were renovating. And then there's a provenance on the wall, which is the fourth part, which is a kind of, you know, history from the present, time moving backward of that little marble fragment. And you learn, you know, that it was Ivanka Trump who selected that marble, in fact, for Trump Tower. You learn all about, you know, where it had come from, and the sort of furthest away origin point was, I think it's something like a hillside in Verona, or Essigmarmi is the quarry. But it was a way to kind of put together all these very disturbing architectural, psychological, and also art historical in terms of display methodology elements, and bring them together to talk about value.
But also in this way that you're kind of, you know, if we bring it back to this idea of the forensic or the dissection, in a way that comes through that meticulous sort of dissection of a provenance, you know, of the history of an object.
Of course, for me, the dissection is the deep dive into the research, and which I find really pleasurable, like sort of being on eBay looking for one thing and finding this other thing, and then starting to trace it and think about it and think, well, how did that marble come to be the marble, and what does that mean? And oh my God, Ivanka Trump selected it? Amazing. And those architects made that building? Okay, that's interesting. And you know, each thing sort of creating a layer, you know, around it. And so I sort of think of my work as sort of like I'm the onion peeler, right? But you get to see all the skins and all the layers as they kind of come apart, and something else is revealed.
I think on that note, Amie, because that was a wonderful description of the way that your practice runs, we'll round off the conversation there. But I have to say thank you so much for joining us today, for especially taking time out during these various premieres of your film in the UK to join us and explore Whisteljacket, but also talk about your new film, which I encourage you all to go and see. So please join me in thanking Amie for this evening's talk.